Good evening. Good evening, everybody. I'm super excited because tonight we have a special guest, Emerald. And I knew you were special when you told me about one of your bread puns that you're using, gluten tag, just like
Yes.
what I like to use. So to everybody who doesn't know gluten tag, it's something crazy bread bakers use. It's like Guten Tag in German, just with gluten, because bread is made out of gluten. So how have you been using that?
So one of my responsibilities at my previous job with Proof is that I would update our farmers market staff with any changes in our menu, just things they needed to know for market day. And I always would just start the text off with gluten tag on it.
Did somebody ever ask you about what gluten tag actually means, or would people just accept it?
I think they got it. They kind of just expect some kind of shenanigans from me, so I don't think they really questioned it.
Yeah, and I'm super excited to have you on the show because I think, to me, you are really a bread artist. And I have some footage. Let me just put this right here on the screen. This is just some of the craziness that you have made. And to me, this is just out of another league. This looks really amazing. And I want to find out more about this, how you're doing that. And yeah, what's the magic behind it, the witchcraft?
I like to think of myself as a bread wizard. I think one of my friends called me one time. So the two examples you showed were both stencils, and I do sourdough art with both scoring and with stencils. And so the tools that I use for that, this is my lom here. I use a Wire Monkey Shop lom. I feel it's the best overall lom, but especially for decorative scoring, because the benefit of a lom like this is that, with a traditional lom, it's got the long handle on it. So you're holding down here and the blade is up here. And I just feel like the further away your hand is from the blade, the less control that you have. Whereas holding it like this is much more like, holding a pencil, more like traditional art. And I feel like you have a lot more control, both in just the way you're able to move it and pressure and stuff like that. But in the two examples you showed, those were stencils, which I make myself. And I've got a big container full of a bunch of the stencils that I've made here.
You made all of them on your own, those stencils?
Yes, I did.
Out of which material are they made?
So it's I've got a sheet of it here. It's Mylar plastic. You can only see it because of the reflection of my computer screen.
Yes.
It's really thin, but that works to its advantage because anyone who might buy a pack of stencils for decorating bread from Amazon or something might find that it's a really kind of thick, rigid piece of plastic. And those kind of stencils are more suited for stenciling flat surfaces like a wall or, anything like that. And bread is not flat, it's got a curve to it. And so when you're trying to use those kinds of stencils, it doesn't conform to the shape of the loaf, which makes it really kind of frustrating to use. And so I've been making stencils myself just as a hobby since I was in high school. I would use them to decorate t-shirts and stuff like that. And so when I was working with Proof and finding that the stencils they just had available weren't really working, I was like, well, I know how to make stencils. I can figure this out. And so there's a lot of experimentation with it took me a few different tries with different thicknesses of sheets until I got to this Mylar plastic. Don't quote me on this. I believe this is the 4mm Mylar plastic. Anyone who actually wants to know, you can DM me on Instagram and I'll find out for sure. But
right, I totally forgot to share. So that's Emerald's Instagram, the gem, the color. Yes.
So I have some of my pre-made stencils here.
That's so cute.
And so I've also kind of taken the opportunity while I'm designing these stencils to design them in a way that kind of mimics bread scoring, because a lot of people who are interested in scoring but don't work at a bakery and don't have hundreds of loaves to score.
So this would be regular bread scoring, right? Sorry there.
Yeah, so that's the traditional wheat stock scoring. Somewhere in my feed there's a scoring of this guy. And so I started to design some of my stencils to kind of replicate scoring. And so these are kind of my score lines here. And some of the people who have gotten these stencils from me have even told me that, they'll stencil it first and then they'll go over the lines and they'll score it just kind of as like a scoring practice. So that's been really cool to hear.
Okay. Just taking one step back, I would be super curious to know, how did you get into this whole bread scoring, stenciling thing? What has been the first bread you ever made? How did you get in general into bread making?
Oh boy. Well, I've been baking a lot and just generally interested in fermentation my whole life. I grew up with my mom in the kitchen. She'd be making kimchi all the time. So that was just something that's been of interest to me. I didn't get really into baking until I was out of college and living on my own. And I had a friend who was having a birthday party and she has celiac disease. And so she asked me if I could make her some gluten-free cupcakes. And gluten-free baking has come a long way than from where it used to be. But, that was like 12 or 13 years ago. So I really wanted to make her something special. And at the time, you couldn't find gluten-free anything in stores. So, I just got to work and I really enjoyed just the alchemy behind baking in general. And, the kind of wizardry, it's a science. It was fun to do experiments. And then just gradually I made my way into bread. But I made the leap into baking professionally just a little over 2 years ago.
Okay. So were you first baking with yeast, or did you directly start with sourdough then? What made you enter the sourdough game?
Yeah, when I first started baking, it was with commercial yeast. I started baking sourdough just really occasionally. I started my first starter maybe 8 years ago, and I would bake something with sourdough like once a month. Very, just pretty average for the home baker. It was really intimidating to me, as it is to a lot of people who are just starting to get into sourdough. Even though I kind of already had the foundational knowledge of bread baking in general, sourdough is a different beast. So
how would you say it's different from the regular bread making?
Well, it's a lot slower.
Yes,
you have to have more of an attention span. You have to not forget, you got to wake up your starter if you're not feeding it regularly and baking regularly. Then you have to, even way before I knew anything about, what an autolyse was, just the individual steps and then the time in between, and maybe I want to make bread right now to have for dinner. Well, it's not going to be sourdough. So maybe I'll do sourdough next week, So it's a lot more planning and foresight, which, can be hard for me. I'm very impulsive. It's like, oh, I want to have pita bread for dinner tonight. So I guess I'm going to, bust out my yeast for that. And so, yeah.
Dinner is in 30 minutes. What am I going to do?
Yeah, it takes a lot more patience. It's like a pet. There's a reason why people name their starters, is that you have to keep it alive. You have to take care of it. You have to make it happy. And so it's a lot more involved. And I think it's just, there seems to be a particular inclination for people who are into sourdough. Like, you have to be like, I don't know anyone who's just kind of into it. You're either like yes. all into it or you're not, and so it's for, the people who are on, the nerdier spectrum of baking.
And now, very important question. What is the name of your sourdough starter?
My sourdough starter is Bready Mercury.
Bready Mercury.
Yeah. I believe he's 8 years old.
8 years old by now.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I would be curious, because I think the one thing that makes in general bread better is the slower fermentation. And I've recently been experimenting also a little bit more with yeast. And I feel that you can make every yeast recipe 10 times better if you were to just add 6 or 7 hours autolyse to it.
Yeah.
So because the bread would just start breaking down, the flour would start to break down a little bit, and the taste would be so much better.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think when a lot of people come to try true sourdough, a lot of people, when I was working at Proof's Farmers Market, they'd be like, oh, this is beautiful bread, but, I don't really like sourdough. And then I'd have to ask them, have you, what kind of sourdough have you had? Is it just from the grocery store? Because that's not real sourdough. That's just flavored bread. And then I would just give them a loaf and tell them, if you like it, come back. And they always did.
So you mean flavored in terms that they added some kind of acidic component to the dough?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is the same kind of phenomenon over where you're at, but here, most sourdough that you find in like a grocery store is just commercial yeast, and they add like citric acid or other flavors to give it like an artificially sour taste. Yeah, I know you guys have higher standards over there. Yeah,
that's what they call.
Like when they say they don't like sourdough, I'm like, well, maybe try this one and see if you change your mind.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, I think also that I've recently read, I don't know if that's true, that people also these days like to use baking powder rather than yeast, because with yeast, you always lose a little bit of the dough, right? So maybe 2 or 3%. But if you do that on an insanely big scale, then 2 or 3% loss is quite a lot, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that also got me started into baking, because I was just reading the package contents of the bread I was buying, and I was thinking, okay, this can't be normal. I didn't know what the ingredients were meaning. Some weird stuff that I never heard about.
Yeah. And so when I was living in the States, I didn't really, so now, maybe like 10 to 15 years ago, I didn't eat a whole lot of bread because I wasn't making bread at home. And, bread from the store, it's okay. It's fine. It'll do the job. But you and I had talked a little bit about how I lived in Germany previously. And I think that's where my love of bread really began. Every Saturday, my parents would take me and my sister down to the bakery, and we would get some bread, and we'd go to the deli and get some meat and cheese and just have a spread. That was just kind of like a celebration of like bread and stuff to put on top of it. And I was really feeling kind of nostalgic for that. And I didn't really know of any like artisan bakeries in my area. I did some searches, didn't really find any. And so I was like, well, I want that. I don't know how to go get it. So I'm just going to try to make it on my own. And so I think that's when I kind of made the step from just doing like yeasted bread to start going into sourdough, because I was just chasing that good German bread.
There's a great question here from Trish, and she's saying, seriously, you're making me wonder if I've ever tasted real sourdough.
Trish, I am not lying to you. Go to whatever your regular grocery store is, pick up a pack of, look at the different sourdough brands. If you see yeast on any of those, it is not sourdough. And then you'll also see, a few ingredients listed where it'll say, added for flavoring. And it's usually stuff like citric acid. And so it gives it an artificially sour flavor that doesn't taste like sourdough. Like sourdough sourdough can have kind of a sour flavor, but it's not like the kind of like very sharp sourness that you'll get in like a store-bought sourdough bread.
There's another great comment here by, I don't know how to properly pronounce your name, TJZFX, I think. And you're saying that since making sourdough, you never have moldy bread anymore, like store-bought bread. It gets dried out sometimes, but it never catches any mold. And I think this is also one of the reasons why you want to make sourdough, because of the acidic component you have inside. It just stays better for a longer period of time compared to just yeast-based bread.
Yeah, fermentation is a natural preservative. When you think about just fermentation in general, sauerkraut, kimchi, these are all things that were made to preserve the shelf life of different things. And sourdough is really no different. And, unless you have a lot of moisture present, your sourdough probably isn't ever going to mold. It's just going to dry out. And then, you've got croutons or breadcrumbs.
Croutons, that's what we like. We Germans like to do is we like to make Knödel out of this. It is just a few. Have you ever tasted Knödel?
Yes.
So to everybody who doesn't know, it's pretty much just 2 or 3 day old bread. And we just chop that into tiny pieces. We wrap that with some eggs and maybe some parsley, and then we just boil it, pour a lot of butter over it, and it's a really delicious way to get rid of all that stale bread.
Yes. Butter is the most important part of that.
So Trish has a small update. None of my family likes sourdough. Now I have to try it for myself. Yes, Trish, that's something you definitely have to do.
So having, most of my sourdough experience was working at a bakery that was based at farmers markets. And I'm a big advocate of just like supporting the local community, the local like food economy. So anyone who's interested in trying like really great artisan bread, find your local farmers market. And I bet the bread that they have there is just going to like blow you out of the water. And they're just going to be full of people who are very eager to talk about their bread.
So I feel when you talk to another baker, you could talk for hours just about different bread techniques, right? That's always amazing.
There's so I was taking a public speaking class a few years ago, and we had to come up with a topic that we were going to give a 2-hour presentation on. And I was like, done, bread. But we had to like get our topics pre-approved, by the professor. And he also wanted to make sure there wasn't any overlap in topics. And so I go, I'm going to talk about bread. And he's like, is there that much to talk about? And I was like, yes.
Little did he know. Little did he know.
I ended up having after I wrote out my whole plan, I ended up having to cut half of it out. And even then I only just made the 2-hour time limit.
Yeah, I think with bread, there's an infinite amount of things that you can talk about. I always find it very fascinating because everybody has slightly different techniques, has some few tricks up their sleeve, something I didn't know about. Bread is just such a fascinating topic.
Yeah, for sure.
By the way, I also added dial-in credentials to the description of the stream. If you want to get a chance to talk to Emerald or me, then all you have to do is follow the dial-in credentials, and you can ask Emerald whatever question you like, or me, of course. So just FYI. Okay, so just going back to, so you were baking at home, and then you started to join a bakery. What made you decide to go from home baking to doing it professionally?
So I am, I was in a military family, so calling any one particular place home is a little different. I lived in Colorado the longest. And so, that's what I consider home. I ended up moving here to Arizona a couple years ago. And before I left Colorado, I was working in an entirely different field. I was working in disability advocacy for 13 years. And I had gotten to the point where I was just really ready for a change. And, what better time than when you, completely move locations and you're starting new. And I was taking a few courses based in fermentation science, and I knew that was generally the kind of area that I wanted to go into. And I was like, okay, well, the big hitters in fermentation are generally like booze or bread. And so it's like, okay, I like to do both. So, which way do I want to go? And so I just decided looking at baking jobs, and then that's just really what hooked me. And
when does the booze follow?
Sorry?
When does the booze follow then?
Well, there's more and more craft breweries popping up here all the time. So, you could always head that way.
And was it a difficult switch for you to go from home bakery then to this professional level? Did a lot of things change for you?
I mean, not as much as I might have thought it would, because while you're moving up in scale by volume, you're also moving up in scale by equipment. And so, if I'm trying to make 100 loaves at home, that's a problem. But if I'm making 100 loaves in a bakery where they have mixers and they have, much better equipment to where one person can tackle much larger quantities of dough and stuff, it really wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. And it's just also something I have a deep interest in. So it was just all very exciting. I was very eager. Yeah.
And what about the working times? Was that a change, or how challenging was that?
I'm naturally a morning person. And so, on a day where I don't have any responsibilities, it's pretty rare for me to wake up past 5 a.m. And so waking up and waking up to go to work at 2 a.m. isn't that much of a stretch for me. It's already suited to my lifestyle is baking because I'm naturally a morning person.
There must be a lot of German ancestors in you, because this sounds so German what you're just saying.
Yeah.
I always wanted. I'm probably not a German because I always like to sleep in late and I like to go to bed early. So I always sleep for a very long period of time.
Well, you're a programmer, right?
True. Yes.
So that's encoded in you.
Yeah, the programmers back then when I was working at Trivago, they would never start working before 10 a.m. or something like that. I used to start maybe at 9-ish or so. So I was always one of the early birds in terms of programmers. And other people were already there at, I don't know, 7 a.m., 8 a.m. And the programmers were always the people to enter last, but they would also leave last, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, my friends know not to expect anything from me if they're texting me after like 7 o'clock. So
okay, so then that wasn't that big of a challenge for you to get up at 2 a.m., but you had to get up at 2 a.m. And everybody was just watching, because many of my viewers are also always considering, okay, maybe I want to take my baking to another level and maybe pursue a professional career. And waking up at 2 a.m. is definitely not something that's for everybody, right? Did you have a few colleagues that struggled a lot?
Yeah, there's definitely some people who, we just know, don't schedule me in the mornings. It's just not going to happen. We're like me also, like, don't schedule me at night. It's not going to happen. And so, I mean, it's not, I mean, I would just in my like cursory searching, it seems like a lot of bakeries are geared towards early morning baking because people want fresh bread and pastries for breakfast, right? And so, you have to get all of that done before, you open. But it also just depends like what the bakery is suited for. Is it a farmer's market? Is it a restaurant? Is it like a wholesale bakery? And so there's some bakeries that operate essentially 24 hours a day. But generally, I would say the majority of bakeries are for like restaurants and dine-in experiences, cafes, and those are the kind of things where you want fresh bread and pastry first thing in the morning. And so I would say that, if you're not a morning person, you probably might have to be or learn how to be.
And if you started at 2 a.m., that still wouldn't be early enough to get bread for breakfast, at least not sourdough, right? The sourdough process would need to start even earlier.
So, yeah, and that's the thing is that, when I was working at Proof, I would be baking off the bread that was mixed and shaped and formed the evening before. And then I would start mixing the set for the next shift. And so it's just kind of a revolving door between the shifts. Yeah.
So what would be the first thing you would do at 2 a.m. coming into the bakery? Turning on the ovens, or what would you do?
Yeah, I'm usually I would usually be the first one in there. And so I would just be turning everything on, looking at the schedule for, what needed to be mixed that day, what needed to be baked that day. I did a little bit of like recipe testing and development. And so I would have little like blocks of time set out for that. And I did a little bit of everything in the process from, doing the mix, doing the stretch and folds, the shaping, rolling out pastry, just a little bit of everything depending on the day.
Rolling out pastry, what's the English word for that dough? Is it laminated dough? Is that the correct term? Yeah, that's something you would also do then already?
I didn't do as much of the laminating. I have a little, like tiny bit of experience with that. It was more like forming the pastry that I would be doing.
What kind of pastry would that be, for instance?
So when I'm talking about all of this, I'm referencing my time at Proof. And so it was all sourdough pastries. And so our basic menu was just the sourdough croissant, pain au chocolat. We did an almond croissant, usually a savory pastry, and then like a sweet pastry special.
Okay.
One of my favorites, though, is that we did a pretzel croissant. That one was my favorite.
Pretzel croissant. Yeah, I've tasted them before. They taste really, really, really delicious. How does it work? You just take the croissant, you boil that in the lye, and then you just let it cool.
Yeah, you can't boil it, and so we would spray it with a lye solution before we baked it.
You sprayed it with a solution.
Yes.
Okay.
Before topping it with like a chunky salt and then baking it.
Okay. I thought you would need to also put it into the boiling lye somehow, but spraying it was enough. Was that hot lye solution or was that cold solution?
No, it was room temperature. It would just, the solution would dissolve in the water if you gave it a good stir. And Yeah, because if you were to drop, any kind of pastry, but especially sourdough, if you're dropping it in boiling water, you're going to kill the yeast and all the butter is going to melt out. And
I
so,
see.
yeah.
That's why you have to spray it. Okay. I learned something new. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
There's
but
a
just
great...
wear gloves and like goggles because you don't want to die.
In your eyes.
You don't want chemical burns. Yes.
Yeah. There's a great question here from Samuel Sperl. Sounds like an Austrian name, maybe. Do you notice any difference in flavor or behavior of your sourdough through the year or seasons? So yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. Have you noticed something similar?
Not that I can point out. It doesn't immediately jump out at me. I notice more of a difference if I change the flour that I use. Not even if it's a flour that has this like a different protein content, but I've been using a lot of local varieties of flours, and just noticing the difference in that has been really astonishing. And that's something I would like to point to one of the advantages of sourdough is that it really like celebrates every ingredient. I mean, there's only 3, right? But in like a traditional bread, can you really, like a yeasted bread from the grocery store, can you really point to what any kind of particular flour tastes like? Like probably not. Like it doesn't have its own really kind of unique flavor. But if you're experimenting with different like flour varieties, it's really like highlighted and really comes out in sourdough in my experience.
I think that's also the miller's job typically.
Yes.
So a large mill would want to make sure that they blend the flour somehow, that the taste is, or the properties of dough handling are very similar throughout the years, I guess, right?
Yes. And like something that I found in our large shipments of flour from at Proof is that even if it was the same variety of flour, depending on, different things that might happen during the growing process or the milling process, even though it was the same variety of flour, like it might behave differently. And so we would kind of have to do, it's not like a large industrial miller that's just making all this like kind of heavily processed flour that's expected to react the same way every time you use it. And so it's just really like I find it to be a very interesting thing because I have my sourdough bread inclination, like nerdy inclinations to be like, oh, so even just like changes, like I shouldn't necessarily expect the same variety of flour to act the same way every time.
And sometimes it can also be a little bit frustrating because when I just change the flour, then suddenly all the timings are off and I just need to adjust the process. And I guess also that's where working in a large bakery comes in very handy because you sort of develop that feeling for how the dough should be, right?
Yeah, and so that's the advantage to it is that the more that you work with bread, the more that you kind of gain that intuition, which I think is the most important like kind of factor to other than having a scale and doing everything by weight. I think the other important thing is just like developing the intuition because, once you have the fundamentals down, then you can really do anything. And so just knowing like what your bread should look like at every stage of the process and then being able to be like, okay, well, this isn't developing enough, so I need to do this instead of, I think a lot of people have they're used to just following word for word what a recipe says and saying, okay, it needs to proof for 2 hours instead of saying, oh, well, it should look like this when it's ready to proof because all of those individual factors of just like, temperature and everything like that, if we all make bread based off of the same recipe right now, but I'm in sunny, hot Arizona and you're in humid, temperate Germany, our proofing times are going to be different. And, you might pull yours prematurely or mine might overproof. And so instead of just relying on those kind of metrics, just knowing, what, just how bread behaves and then being able to kind of, modify your process around that.
So the viewers have already been asking some questions around the scoring. See, Fazio, for instance, the process leading up to scoring. We're going to be talking about the scoring in just a little bit. And there we also had a great comment from Jakub. And that was, I wanted to go super artistic once on my bread. Well, it turned out super autistic instead. So I've been there as well, so my scoring never looks as beautiful as the scoring that you are doing.
Okay, I'm gonna have a little bit of a talk with you guys. A lot of people, a lot of people will look at my scoring on Instagram or just like anybody's stuff on Instagram, and they'll be like, wow, my scoring never looks like that. But you know, you're only seeing what we choose to show you. You know, for instance, I remember when I was trying to do that spider web loaf that you just showed, I was doing that for Halloween. I had to try that scoring pattern to get it out just how I wanted to, like at least 8 times. And each time I would do it on 2 sets of loaves like that. And so it wasn't until that 8th time, my 10th loaf of bread, or, you know, or whatever, that like I was able to get it to look like that. So you're only really seeing what I want you to see, or what anyone else on Instagram or the internet wants you to see. You don't see like the other like tens or hundreds of loaves that I bake on any given day and see what those look like, right? And so
you're the scoring samurai, Keith is saying. Do you have a katana? That would be badass to use a katana sword to do the scoring.
I think I might like permanently injure myself if you do something like that.
Okay, so for the scoring, you mentioned that you came in and then you were scoring some of the breads from some of the doughs from the previous day. Is that when you started your sort of becoming artistic with scoring, or have you already been doing that before?
Oh no, it was like just something I hadn't even considered before I started working at Proof. And so when I first started, my main kind of role was just to do the big bread bake before our Saturday markets. And I was working side by side with Amanda, and she was just like cranking out these like incredible wheat stalks, and I was just blown away. And you know, she taught me the basics. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so she would teach me the basics, and then once I kind of had a good grip on like how the bake worked, how the oven worked, she was just like, you know, okay, you can score whatever you want, have fun. And so I really just like, you know, I'm scoring,
that's amazing.
You know, on a given day, if I'm scoring 500 loaves, I get bored after a while if it's the same pattern. And so I really just started to play around. And, you know, so that's an advantage that I would have, is that I have all of these loaves to experiment with that the average baker does not, you know. And so I've really been trying to, like, through my platform, help people who don't have, you know, hundreds of loaves to bake by volume. Like, I try to give away like some of my tips that I've learned just by sheer experience. And so I just really started to play with it. I really like art. I like to draw. And I was just like, I can draw on bread. Are you kidding me? And so I was just like, okay, well, what else can I do? And so I just went from like scoring to coming up with different techniques, getting into stenciling. And so it's been a really cool experience to just kind of combine 2 things that I really love that I never really thought would have gone together before.
How much time would you say you have when you have to score 500 breads to score an individual bread?
So the deck oven that we used holds 48 sourdough loaves at a time. And the full baking process is 32 minutes. And so I would have to do the math, but I think broke it down to like, you don't want to spend any more than like 20 seconds on a loaf. And so with my more like intricate scoring, I'm not talking about that, but just like the average, like stuff like that, like I can do that in 10 seconds or less.
In 10 seconds or less.
Yeah. Because the other thing to consider is that, you know, we live in the Arizona desert. In the summer, it's really hot. And, you know, heat is not your friend when it comes to sourdough. And so I was also just working against the clock. The longer that I spent on scoring, the longer the bread was sitting out before I went into the oven. And like it could get overproofed.
So it would sit there for maybe 10 minutes or 20 minutes at the most while you're doing the other scorings. Did I just do the math correctly?
Yeah, I would just have like a speed rack of bread. And so I think that would average out to like 80 loaves of bread sitting on the speed rack, something like that. And you know, I wouldn't want it to sit out for any longer than it absolutely had to, because it might be like 115 degrees near the ovens. And so I would want to get them in in the ovens. So I'd bring them out while bread's already in there. I'd start scoring them, getting them ready so I could just toss them in as soon as the ovens were available. And so I've gotten really good at speed scoring. That's for sure.
Just a general question. We've been talking about scoring all the time, but maybe you could explain one more time, please, why in general do you want to score your bread? And what is that actually? What is scoring a bread? What does it mean?
So scoring, just like the very basic kind of definition, is just cutting your bread. And the reason that you want to do that is that when you're baking a loaf of sourdough, just and I'm not really talking about enriched doughs here, like sandwich breads and stuff like that, just flour, water, salt, sourdough bread. When you throw it into the oven, if you don't score it, the loaf is going to find the weakest point in the surface of the skin to expand as it rises. And so you can control both the way that the loaf expands and where by scoring it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And so otherwise, like a lot of us might have experienced forgetting to scoring a loaf, or like if you just don't score loaves, you put it into the oven, it kind of just like bursts in a random place. Or some people will have like a big kind of like tumor that grows out of the side. It's just like the bread needs to expand. If you don't give it an easy place to do it, it'll just find a place to do it on its own.
So here, for instance, you would have applied an incision and near the center of the dough to allow it to
so
rise.
that's just kind of like that one's just kind of like a modified ear. And so I just made the ear like pointy, like a spider web. But yeah, and so that's where like the kind of ear comes from, is that, you know, that just tends to maintain the shape of the loaf in like its original form. So when you take your bread out of the bowl or out of the banneton, we want it to like kind of stay in that shape at the end. And so the way that you kind of do that is by doing a little ear, and then it maintains that shape and doesn't warp as it bakes.
Okay. And for me as a home baker, I just score one bread per day. Do you have some tips on how to practice scoring a little bit, or which tools should be used in general for scoring?
So yeah, for practicing scoring, someone did ask me if I've ever used anything like Play-Doh or stuff like that. I haven't, but I know people who do. And so I can just kind of pass that along. I think the most important part of getting used to scoring is just getting used to how whatever lame you're using behaves and how it feels in your hand and how you can manipulate it. So like just using something like Play-Doh, I think is a great idea. So just being able to take it and carving into the dough, because each, you know, kind of lame acts different. This is the one I use from Wire Monkey Shop. And because it's also just like a thin, straight blade. And so even if you're used to doing stuff like drawing, if you want to get into artistic loaves, you know, it doesn't exactly behave the same way as like a pencil might. And so, you know, if you want to get used to like doing curves and things, you just kind of have to learn the muscle memory.
I find curves the hardest. Yeah.
Yeah, curves are hard because it's a flat blade. So how do you get tight curves in there? And it's just like the hard part is like there's no easy way. You just have to practice. You just have to get used to it. And I can really tell you all of my tips and tricks, but a lot of the bread making process is like the intuition, knowing how it feels is a big part of it. I can't really show you how it feels. And especially since like the bread I make, maybe it's a different hydration, maybe it's a different protein content, maybe, you know, I shape in a different way. Our breads are just not always going to behave the same way. So even if I tell you exactly everything that I do, it might not exactly translate to whatever bread you're making.
Okay, interesting. And if you show the blade, so first one question, my English is never so good being a German, so that's called is it called a lame? Is that a proper pronunciation?
That's what I've heard.
Okay.
So if anyone here is French, I'm sorry. So it's spelled Lame, and
that's not pronounced lame.
No, that means something else.
Okay, so
as far as
lame.
I know, most people I've seen, there's like, I don't know, it's like a tomato thing. As an American, I'm sure the French feel differently about that, you know. But
okay.
I call it a lame. Yeah.
Okay. And what's the difference to using the tool that you have versus just using a razor blade? Is that for protection that you don't cut yourself?
Yeah, for the most part. So, half of the blade sticks out and half of it is kind of encased in here. And so it's a double-edged razor. And so there's not really any safe way to just hold on to it. Before we started getting these loms at Proof, we had the traditional loms that were, just like the curved razor at the end of the stick. I hated those so much that I just refused to use them. And I would just hold the double-edged razor to my own peril. So I don't recommend it. It's not safe, but this is the closest thing you can get, I think, to just holding the blade directly in your hand, which is what I was, wanting to do.
So Political Chef has been saying that he use a gigantic fillet knife. Have you ever seen people using a gigantic fillet knife to score the bread?
Yeah, like, whatever works for you. Like it, you don't have to do something that's like Instagram worthy or whatever, as long as it's like functioning in the way that you want, then, use a steak knife. Who cares? Like if it's working for you, you don't need anything special. Like if you want to do like all the crazy stuff that I do, then maybe you need the extra tools. But if you're just making a loaf of bread at home for yourself, like who cares?
So Sifazio has been saying he also didn't use a protection on his lamb. Have you ever cut yourself?
Yes.
That way?
Yeah. At like my workstation, I would keep like little things of gauze, and I would keep like sanitizing pads and Band-Aids and stuff. And so it's not the wisest thing. I would get little like nicks on my fingers. It's fine.
Maybe that enhances the taste of the actual bread.
Maybe it does.
Okay, so about scoring. And when you would normally score your bread, which sort of angle would you be using to score your bread to make this incision?
So it depends on what kind of scoring you're doing. And so I don't know if there's like an accepted kind of term for either of these, but just for the sake of this, I'll refer to the two types of scoring as functional scoring and decorative scoring. And so functional scoring is just, the kind of scoring we were talking about previously, when you just want to control where the loaf expands. And so most commonly for people when they bake bread, that looks like the ear score or like the big X, stuff like that is what I would call functional scoring. So for that kind of scoring, you're kind of going at like what would you call that? Like a 30-degree angle? Yeah, maybe 45, a little above that, just like a little bit angled. And so, and you want to go like, and most loms are kind of designed in the same way, where you want to go like as deep as the blade will allow you to go. I think a big mistake people do just in scoring in general is that they're a little too nervous. And I think that bread can smell your fear, bread, especially when it comes to scoring. One of the most important things is having a steady, consistent pressure and a little bit of speed. Like if you're a little unsure of yourself and you're just kind of like going a little bit and stopping, it'll snag on the loaf and you'll end up like with really jagged looking cuts. And so when I do it, it's like a really swift motion with like a good amount of pressure as well. And so for like any kind of functional scores, and also just like, the cuts that you do in a baguette, they're all kind of at that same angle. And so you're kind of cutting close to being underneath the skin at about like that 35 to 45 degree angle. But if you're doing decorative scoring, you're cutting straight down. So you're wanting two different things from this.
So this pretty much combined the two things in one bread, right? You had the functional scoring in the center and then the decorative scoring in the front.
Yes. And so like all my decorative scoring is always cutting straight down. So, like this.
And would the dough that you scored, would it typically be cold proofed, or was the dough at room temperature?
Cold proofing is always best because as the dough gets warmer, it gets softer. It starts to get gassy. It starts to expand, which makes for, like it makes scoring pretty difficult. I think the colder the dough, the better. I've heard some home bakers even like to throw their dough in the oven, or not the oven, in the freezer for a few minutes. I've never done that. I always just pull it straight from the fridge. As long as you like when it's nice and cold, and you've done a nice job shaping it, building that tension, that really helps with scoring. Because what you're doing when you're scoring is you're really building off of the shaping that you've done previously. All of that gluten development is what's causing scoring to happen, because you're cutting into it and you've built up all that tension in there, and then it starts to release. Because as soon as you start scoring, those cuts should start to expand a little bit. And so that all comes from everything you've done up until that point with the gluten development and the shaping.
I get a great question related to that topic by NF1000. I never get a beautiful ear. Can that also be caused by shallow scoring?
Yes, I really do think so. So one thing, there's a few things that could be happening there. It could have to do with shallow scoring. That could be a big one, because I really do think that people are a little too scared to cut deeply in their bread. I think you have a bigger risk of not scoring deep enough. And so that could be one element. It could also be shaping. You know, with sourdough and fermentation, there's so many steps involved. But if you're getting a good rise in your bread, everything else seems to be coming into play. I would try to cut deeper next time. I think that could really help. And the other thing, so cut deeper, and also cut at that like 45 degree, not 45, I would say 35 degree angle.
And the breads at proof that you made on a large scale, would they always typically have around the same hydration?
Yes, it was always around like 82%.
Okay, but there was also whole wheat all the time, right? It was not bread flour; it was whole wheat.
There's a blend of whole wheat flours in there.
Okay,
it's not 100% whole wheat, but yeah, there's it's pretty thirsty flour. So hydration isn't everything. A lot of people get really fixated on the hydration, but you know, high hydration isn't necessary for a lot of things.
So we have Rangefinder General saying, sorry, late to the party. Hi, Emerald. I love your work. And yes, Emerald, your work is really amazing.
Well, everybody welcome who just to the party.
Everybody who just joined. So the Gem the Color on Instagram, that's Emerald's account. And today we are we're talking about bread scoring. And by the way, there's the dial-in credentials in the description of the video. So if some of you wants to join us and ask a few questions in person, that's your chance to be live on the show. Don't be shy. We don't bite. Awesome. Okay,
yeah, and so something, just while I'm thinking about it, the other thing, like since we're talking about ear scoring and just decorative scoring in general, the deeper you cut, the wider the cut is going to open. And so that's one thing that's really important to consider when you're doing these decorative designs. Like if you have the one of my wheat stock again, you can see in the variations I have in my wheat stock, I like to play on the depths of the cut. The one that's like in the front, further back in the first row, I'm kind of alternating between deep cuts and really shallow cuts to get different design elements. And so that's just like a really cool thing you can play around with when you're experimenting with scoring. It's just like, try different depths of cuts and see what happens. You can make some really cool designs that way.
There's another question here coming from Martina. Question for both. Have you ever tried to score with a wet blade? Have you noticed any difference? I think that's a better question for you, Emerald.
So I haven't personally. Usually when you're kind of dipping anything in water when you're working with bread, that be your hands or your blade, it's because your dough is pretty sticky. And so, you need wet hands or a wet blade to, have an easier time working with the bread. And so if I'm having a batch of dough that's particularly sticky, then I might oil it or I might get it wet. But on a usual day, I don't have to. I've heard from a lot of people that does help, though.
There is another great question here by Political Chef again. What flour on top, rice? And let me just, before answering that question, when you shape the dough, you place it in a banneton, I assume, right? That's typically what you do. Do you rub your dough with some sort of flour before you place it in a banneton? Do you place flour in the banneton? I would be curious. Maybe you can include that in your answer.
Yeah, so I have a so for both scoring and for treating the loaf before putting in the banneton, I use rice flour. And so I shape the loaf. I have like a wide bowl that has some rice flour in it, and I just give the loaf a nice toss in there before I put it in the banneton. Then when I take the loaf out of the banneton after a cold proof and get ready to score it, then I dust the top with rice flour. And that's how you get that really nice opaque white surface. Some people have said they do a blend of all-purpose and rice flour, or they just use all-purpose flour. I haven't had any particular luck with that. But the rice flour is just how you, and it's purely for aesthetic reasons when it comes to scoring. Like there's no real function to using rice flour. It's not going to make it so that your bread doesn't, come out right. It's really just for the pretty stuff. And so if you're not interested in that, don't sweat it. But like if you want that really nice surface, and so for stenciling and scoring both, you get that really nice contrast and it really sticks out. So you have like the darker stencil lines or the darker scoring lines with the white rice flour background. So it just really pops out. And so it's purely for decorative reasons.
What I have noticed myself is when I place my dough in the banneton before, these days I like to use just regular all-purpose or bread flour for giving it a nice rub. Because I'm not on the level of making artistic designs yet. And by doing so, the flour is absorbed a little bit by the actual dough. So you won't see the flour after taking it out of the banneton. But that really also enables you to, what some people also consider a defect, but I like it. You will get some blisters while your bread is baking in the oven. Oh,
blisters are great.
I just like them for the crispness. It just adds another level of crispness to it.
And it's like, it's a visual representation of the whole process of sourdough. You can see the fermentation happening. Like, I think it's really cool. I think it's really pretty too. Yeah. Yeah.
And so what I noticed is by giving my dough this rub, I feel that sometimes the surface is a little bit drier in the end. So the hydration of the surface is lower than of the rest of the bread. And I feel that that also makes the whole scoring process just a little bit easier.
Yeah. And so, you're absolutely right. Like it dries out and gives it a nice little skin. And so I think that helps both with scoring and stenciling a little bit. So it kind of gives you kind of like a flat canvas. And so, because if you're trying to if you're trying to score the dough while it's sticky, that's maybe when you need to wet the blade because the surface isn't drying up and the blade is snagging. And so, when I toss my loaf in rice flour after shaping, and then later when I pull it out, most of it, the rice flour has been absorbed. There might still be like a little bit sitting on top that I just brush off. But that's definitely something that I've noticed too.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Yeah, there's so much to learn about scoring. I think the key is really to practice a lot, right? That's how you just get better at it.
Yeah, just like anything, which is, not the answer anyone really wants to hear. And me especially, I'm a very impatient person. Like if I'm not good at something right away, I'm very upset. And so it's really just something you have to practice.
We have somebody, hey, Jethy, checking in from Manila. So people from all around the world are here watching us, listening to us talk about sourdough and scoring.
That's awesome. Yeah, sourdough is universal. Like it's, every culture around the world has their own version of sourdough, and I think it's great.
Another question that I wanted to run by you, talking about Christmas, I like a bit more on my loaves. Does steam affect this? How would you go about making a very crispy loaf?
Yeah, so I think heat and steam play a part into that, and also just like the duration of your bake. I like a really dark loaf. I think it's more flavorful. It has that nice, really thick, hard crust. And so in sourdough baking, you need an injection of steam in the beginning, whether you're putting in steam in a you're putting boiling water in a tray. But if you keep the steam in there the whole time, it's going to keep hydrating the crust and it's going to keep it soft. And so a lot of people play around with where they remove the steam, but generally at the halfway point. So the bread should be done rising. it should be at the full part of its expansion when you take the steam out. You don't want to take it out too early, because also you want to keep the steam is necessary anyway, because you've got to keep the skin soft so that it can expand and it doesn't start to harden prematurely. And so once the loaf has just fully expanded to as far as it's going to go, then you could take the steam out, and then the outer crust will start to dry, and then it'll start to darken. And that's where like I get really excited about it, because with like, you know, the artistic loaves, that's where you get the contrast. You know, that's when the design elements really start to pop. But then also I think just like the flavor of a dark crust is great. And so
I totally agree. I think the combination of the different consistencies and flavors, that's what makes an amazing sourdough.
Yeah.
There was a great question or a great remark again by Political Chef. Curious, as an extra chef on a restaurant hotel side, do they ever hire bakers for bread? Do they still outsource? I don't know. I've actually never seen a hotel making fresh bread. Have you seen that before?
Maybe on like a really high end hotel. Like I know, like just like in people in my circle, people I know who work in bakeries or, you know, bake bread and pastry in restaurants. It tends to be one person who does both bread and pastry. I think it's less likely that people are hired just for bread, maybe unless it's like a sandwich restaurant or something that wants to make their own bread.
Makes sense.
Yeah. A lot of I think a lot of restaurants don't bother with making their own bread in-house because I've noticed that a lot in like just in kitchens. There's like the bread-minded people, and then there's like the cooking people, and they're two very different fields. Like they're both based on like intuition and things, but you know, I feel like, you know, bread and pastry is much more rigid and a lot more temperamental, whereas like you can do a lot of things to kind of fix something in cooking if you've done something wrong, but I think the margin of error is a lot smaller for stuff like bread when you're dealing with yeast and time and fermentation, that a lot of people just don't really bother doing it in-house. Like it's just too much of a pain.
And I think many restaurants also underestimate how important bread is, because at least here in Germany, when you go to a restaurant, the first thing you're typically served is a slice of bread, maybe some butter, maybe some olive oil with it. And if that first impression is bad, then you can do as much as you want. If the main course is great, still you'll have that bad experience from the start with a bad bread.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I think people don't know how good bread can be. I think, you know, their expectations are pretty low just based off like what they've grown up with, what they've been offered, what's available in stores. You know, they haven't really experienced like an artisan bread and the depths of flavors and textures. Like, you know, what kind of texture is there in, you know, a store-bought sandwich bread? It's all just like fluff that melts in your mouth and doesn't really particularly have a flavor, you know. And it's really like, oh, it's the vessel for something else. It's not something that you really particularly want to enjoy by itself. It's not good enough to just kind of enjoy it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was once lucky to be in a 2-star Michelin restaurant, and the food was amazing. But then there was one course where they served bread, which they made in the restaurant. And I mean, I've eaten a lot of bread, and I also made my own bread. And just the whole experience was suddenly not so good anymore because the bread simply wasn't good. So they made it there, but still it wasn't on the same quality as an average homemade bread, I would say.
Man, that's bold to have just like a bread offering and then it's not even good. Man.
But I mean, imagine if you were to come into a restaurant, into a very fancy restaurant, and you would get a tiny bread like this at the start. I think this would really make a difference with the logo maybe of the restaurant where you are, something like that. That would be something people would remember. Yeah,
and that's something I've started doing recently for a lot of cottage bakers, you know, people who sell bread out of their homes in the US. You know, ever since I started working at Proof, I've been getting in touch, you know, getting to know a lot of people in like the bread world, a lot of them being in the cottage bakery world. And I've been making them little stencils of their logos to, you know, slap on their bread. And so it's been really cool.
So you're selling those stencils now? Did I understand that correctly? Or are you about to launch something there? What is your plan?
Yeah, so I don't have like an official site yet. That's something I'm still like playing around with, looking at my options and stuff. But if you're interested, I have whatever stencils you see on my Instagram are available, any of my pre-made designs. And then I also have been making a lot of custom designs. I actually have a bunch that I need to finish up and mail out fairly soon from a lot of cottage bakers in like the US, a lot of them in like California and on the East Coast who want like, to brand their loaves that they sell at the market. And so I've been
So to all the chefs who are now watching, please get in contact with Emerald if you want to have your custom homemade custom stencil.
Slide into my DMs, as the kids say.
Awesome. Okay, and we talked a lot about scoring, and
yeah.
I wanted to also talk a little bit more about the stenciling technique. You already briefly talked about it at the start. Could you maybe, for somebody who has never even heard the term stenciling, just explain one more time what this magic is about?
Yeah, sure. So stenciling is something I really recommend for people who are maybe, intimidated by scoring. There's a lot that I think you have to really kind of learn the intuition for when it comes to scoring.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be really frustrating to people, to try to score something. And they, maybe they're only working with loaves once a week. And, week after week, their scoring just doesn't come out. I recommend stenciling, honestly. And it's a lot easier to get the hang of. And it's, not nearly as complicated. And so here's a little garden gnome stencil. This one is based off of one of my scoring designs. And
I think he looks like me.
Oh, yeah. So, and I have a tutorial. I actually think I use this stencil too. It's on my Instagram, like my IG TV tab. So what you want to do, pull your loaf out of the fridge once it's, properly fermented. Get your baking station set up however you do it. Put your loaf down on your board. And then if you kind of have any excess flour sitting on the surface, you just kind of want to lightly brush it off. And then, so maybe people who are experienced sticky loaves don't have to do this next part. But if you've got a nice dry surface, I have like a spray bottle and I just lightly mist it with water. And then you take your hand and you distribute the water over the surface of the dough. And what you're trying to do there is just kind of like lightly hydrate the surface of the dough, just enough for both your stencil and the rice flour to stick. And so you don't necessarily want to get it too wet. And this is something that's kind of hard to explain like verbally. But if you're looking at your loaf and it's just like really shiny, or you see little like pools of water sitting on top, it's too wet. Let it dry off a little bit. Just let it air dry. And then you stick your stencil down. So say my hand is the loaf. And then you just kind of lightly press down all the little details of the loaf or of the stencil. So all the parts are sticking. And then you can apply rice flour to the top, either by hand or with like a sifter. And you can be pretty generous with the amount of flour. I think there's more of a risk of putting too little than putting too much. And then what you do there is then you just start to distribute the flour. And the general rule for stencils is that you want to work from the inside out. And so you never really want to be taking flour from here and pushing it up, because then you risk getting flour underneath the stencil, which kind of is, takes away from the purpose of what you're trying to do. And so the way that I do it is I kind of have my 3 fingers like held flat like this. And then I do like a smooth, even push from the center out. And so another reason for that is like, say, your stencil isn't completely sticking to the loaf, or it's not completely flat. If you have your fingers like this, as your fingers are kind of pushing the flour, it's also going to be pushing the stencil down. And then you just kind of like push it around until you have a nice even coverage. It looks the way that you want it. And then you just kind of pick up one edge of the stencil. Oh, you can't even see. I was too far over. And then you just peel it off in one smooth motion.
Okay, and then the idea is that below the stencil, you have less flour than in the surrounding.
Yeah, so what you're doing with a stencil is you're controlling where the flour goes on your loaf. And so if you're using rice flour on this, your design is essentially going to look like the opposite of this. You're going to have a loaf that has a dark outline of this loaf with a white surface. And so it's going to, so I did this to kind of replicate scoring, right? And so this is actually a scoring design that I did last spring. I did like a little series of scoring that was like garden themed. And so I had a garden gnome and I had like a little mushroom. And so I decided when I started to make bread stencils specifically to kind of mimic scoring for people who, you know, are a little intimidated by scoring. And so some people have even told me after using my bread stencils, they've kind of used that as like a guideline to practice scoring. And so they would apply the stencil and then they would remove it and then they would practice scoring within those stencil lines to kind of get used to, you know, how scoring works, which I thought was like really cool. That was something I never would have thought of.
So just as an example, here on this bread, for instance, you would then have a stencil which looks exactly like this pattern, more or less.
Yes, no, I do have that. I do have that pattern.
Would you do the scoring before applying the rice flour, or would you do the scoring of the whole bread after applying the rice flour?
I always do it afterward because one thing that happens, so I really like that also that contrast from the scoring. So in those big decorative loaves, you see that like ring in the center. That's my functional scoring. And so that's where the bread is expanding. And I have a surprise I can actually show you.
Okay.
So you and I had a talk about how I'm having an interesting time kind of with, you know, you had asked me earlier, you know, did I struggle with like going from being a home baker to be a professional baker, where my actual problem is going from being a professional baker to being a home baker and having to like figure out the oven that I have now and all those elements. But I made something.
Gluten talk.
So
that's amazing.
I can actually talk about the centerpiece there. So before, when I was talking about the decorative and functional scoring, so this would be like my decorative scoring, the wheat stock here. And then, so I'm having issues with steam, I think. I'm not getting the rise that I want. But when the loaf is on your table and you're scoring it, what I like to do for these big decorative loaves is I like to score it. And this one is more at like a 45-degree angle. I just do like a big circle all the way around. Ideally, when the steam is right and the bread bakes how I want it to, this part like lifts and rises really dramatically. And this really like sticks out in a 3D way. So this is like a 1,500 gram loaf. So by weight,
1,500 grams.
Yeah.
So 1,500 grams of flour, or in total 1,500?
Total.
Total.
So this is scaled out to 1,500 grams. So for comparison, those big circular loaves that you're showing on screen are 3,000 grams.
I need to grab this somehow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, seriously. So angles are everything when you're scoring, and you can really play with it and see what the different angles do. And, you know, you can come up with a whole entirely new different style. If any of you aren't aware, there's I'm not the only person who does this, and I wouldn't even consider myself to be like the best person. There is a huge thriving community on Instagram of people who do bread art, and they're mostly home bakers. I don't think a lot of them even sell their bread. They just do it for fun. And the things that people come up with are wild. And so if you look up like the hashtag bread scoring on Instagram, you'll see stuff you never even would have thought would be possible. And like I did this art, I did this challenge last year called Breadtober, which is based off of like a, so there's an art challenge in October called Inktober, where people who do like pen and paper art will have like a themed challenge for the whole month of October. And I had just really gotten into like the bread art community. I was like, okay, so let's do a challenge with bread art. And so we have like these weekly themes and everyone jumped in and played, and it's a really cool community. And if you want to see a lot of like amazing things that people do with sourdough that would just absolutely blow your mind. Like, just look on Instagram. There's a ton on there.
By the way, I've been reading through all the comments, and when you showed that bread, people were just going crazy. What an amazing bread you made there.
I had to do something special.
And there's another great question from Arthur. Arthur is asking, or more saying, you can also use scissors to score and create very easy and cool effects. Have you ever tried using a scissor for scoring?
Oh, yes. Have you seen my snake baguette?
No, I have not seen. Is that on your Instagram account as well?
Yeah, and actually, my favorite one that I've done with scissors, I wonder if for this kind of thing, if I should just like send you a link to a post directly, if that would be the best way. There's one where you really don't even have to scroll very far, where I made this like this bread wreath.
Wow.
Yeah, I use scissors for that.
Look at this, everybody. This is next level. This looks amazing.
So
that's so much crust.
Yeah, that's the other good thing. It's all crust. Or like I'll take a boule and I'll snip away and I'll cut in different ways to get different designs.
Wow.
So this is just from like just a basic boule, and I would use scissors to manipulate the dough in different ways. One of my favorite ways that I think this was the first time that I had ever done this was I made the Seashell Loaf.
Wow, crazy. This looks amazing.
Yeah, so
imagine
like
you are in
I'll just be looking at a loaf of sourdough, and I'm supposed to make like these loaves that are called centerpieces. The whole kind of appeal to them is that they're like a centerpiece for your dinner table, right? They're supposed to be a visual center, like focal point. They're supposed to be really pretty and decorative. And so someone will have ordered a centerpiece, and I'm just looking at the loaf, and I'm like, okay, what can I do with this? And so I'll look over and I'll see some scissors, or I will have like just been on Instagram and I see that people are using like dyed flour. And so I'm always just like getting bored of one thing and then moving on to the next thing, which I think is also something that's just really common in sourdough people, is that we're never satisfied and we're always trying to make things harder and more interesting for ourselves.
So I just read Kyle has been commenting that you also have a tutorial of that on your YouTube channel. And to everybody, I linked Emerald's Instagram and YouTube channel inside of the description as well. So please check that out later as well.
Thanks, Kyle. My biggest fan. He's my boyfriend.
Keith is saying no oil company, please.
What does that mean?
I think he means don't do any of those breads for oil companies.
Oh, no.
Okay. Okay, and then let's move on to this question, because that also brings me, I'm just pulling up my questions here. By the way, I'm really bad at multitasking, so I apologize if it sometimes seems like I'm lagging behind a little bit. I'm just having a hard time focusing on all the things happening at once.
You're on the other side of the world. It's fine. Yeah.
So that would be my next question. Those stencils, for instance, gluten tag. How do you make something like that? So
I started making stencils on my own in high school, and the most like basic way that you can make stencils is with a self-healing mat and an X-Acto knife and a sheet of stencil plastic. And so I buy the sheets. Oh, and now I have like brand all over this from the bread I just pulled out. But so I buy these in packs on Amazon, but they also carry like plastic sheets that are appropriate for stencils in like craft stores. They have them there too. And so the self-healing mat is just like a base to be able to like cut through without damaging whatever surface you're on. And it also helps from like keeping your blade from dulling prematurely, because it's like a partially soft surface. And so I was cutting stencils by hand for 15, 16 years, maybe. It was only recently that I ended up getting a machine to help me do it. And so, yeah, can you see it in the background? That's my stencil cutting machine.
That's just for making stencils.
Yeah, and so it's a machine that has a little blade in it, and you can input different designs, and it'll just cut out the design. And so most people, I think, who use it are like into scrapbooking and stuff like that. There's all kinds of uses that you can have for it, but I use it for stencils. So it's called a Cricut. Cricut is how it's spelled. And so, you know, it's like a $300 machine. Like if you're interested in stencils, I would recommend just try cutting them by hand first. But it saves a lot of time. It saves a lot of hand cramping. And especially since I started making stencils for like other people, if I wanted to like charge like a price that would be fair to me, it would be way too expensive for like anybody to want to buy because of how much time it takes to cut a stencil by hand.
So could you make that Gluten-Tag stencil by hand? I mean, it's very nice and round, right? Also the 3D effect you have. Is that even possible to do it by hand? Oh yeah,
that's totally possible to do by hand. So these stencils that I use for this loaf, each letter is its own individual stencil that I placed by itself. And so that's one thing that I like to do is I have like alphabet sets. And so you can just put the individual letters together in, you know, whatever arrangement that you want. And so if you want to do a lot of phrases or sayings, you don't have to commit to one or the other. You can just come up with whatever you want to put. So yeah, these are just individual. Each one of these was a individual stencil.
Okay, that makes sense. So you have just a set of different letters, and then you can just write whatever you want directly on the bread. That's awesome.
Yeah, essentially, because one thing, so it's something that it took me a really long time to be able to do, because I would say it's pretty difficult, is being able to do, is to be able to like score lettering is very difficult. Like, because one of the hardest things to do with scoring is like really tight, round curves. So stuff like the letter O, the letter G, those suck to do by scoring. It's very hard to do. And I've like been able to do it, but it's pretty hard. And
okay.
Frustrating. So, you know, stencils are definitely the way to go if you want to do lettering. I think it's a lot easier to draw by scoring than it is to use.
Have you heard about people doing that using a 3D printer?
Have I tried a 3D printer?
No. Have you heard people trying to use a 3D printer to make stencils?
I haven't, but people make everything with 3D printers. I would be surprised if somebody hasn't.
So, vegan Demic, you need to try that with your 3D printer and let me know if that works. Yes, report back, exactly.
Yeah, so it's not a 3D printer. So all this does is it's a machine that you put, so it comes with like a mat. It's like a sticky mat, and then you put the stencil sheet on top of it, and it kind of works just like it's not a printer, but it kind of behaves in the same way. But instead of like ink, it has a blade. And so it takes the design that you input to the machine and it draws it with the blade. And so I don't have my iPad in this room. So essentially I design my stencils by drawing it on my iPad, and then I upload it to the machine, and then it cuts out the design. And so like the example of what I showed with like the garden gnome, I have a few different other kinds of sets. They're all like the one you showed with the heart that says carbs. These are all ones that I drew out myself, and then.
So this one you made yourself, not using the machine.
Oh no, not by hand. These are ones that I use with the. Well, I mean, what I mean by that is I made this design. I drew this design and then put it through the machine.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Hi, does everyone want to see my puppy?
Yes, please. Hello. Oh, so cute.
This is Noodles. We went to the vet this morning. She's 14 weeks and she's 15 pounds. She's usually not allowed in here. So she's very cute. Okay, bye, baby.
Need a jockey.
Bye, Kyle.
Has she ever tried bread yet or not?
No, not yet. I'm trying not to give her people food so she doesn't get any wrong ideas.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's my stencil process. But yeah, so I use an app called Procreate, which is just like an app that you use to draw. So I have like some of the custom things I've been doing in here. One of my bread friends has the Instagram handle Sourdough Graham, and she wanted to be able to brand her loaves, right? So I drew this in here in Procreate, and then I put it into the app for my machine, the Cricut app, and then I tell it to cut, and it cuts out whatever I want. And so here are some of the like just the stencils I've been making for people recently. Some of them are based off of like, you know, logos they already have. Some of them they want me to design something for them, and so it's been a lot of fun to do.
Are there limits to the stencils? How small some of the cuts can be, or because I saw the design of the two birds was very delicate.
Yeah,
right?
So for something like that, it would have to be like if you want all of these individual like elements. So this is one. So I took the base design and then I had to simplify it because there's if I want to make this to be able to fit, I believe it was like a 900 gram loaf of bread. That's about like 4.5 to 5 inches wide is where you would want it to be. So if you were to take this and scale it down to, you know, however big that is, it's going to be really difficult to get all those little like details to come out in the way that you want. And so there are limits to it, especially since like most people who want to brand their loaves, they're probably not selling, you know, they're probably not making one at a time. They're probably doing these for markets or whatever else. So they're going to take this stencil and they have to make it come out nicely 100 times. They probably don't want to like spend too much time, you know, paying attention to each individual detail of each loaf. And so I try to make it in a way to where they're like, there's enough detail to it be like true to the original design and not compromise, but also not be like a pain to use, you know? So it's definitely like something I've had to experiment a lot with, just kind of learning how small and detailed you can make things without, while still like having the design come out in the way that you want.
I think the viewers were able to ask some questions in advance, and I think we all answered most of them. But there's one more great question from Nancy. I'm putting it on here on the screen. Nancy was wondering, how do you keep OvenSpring from distorting your designs? That's my biggest problem. Yeah, sure. So that's the reason I'm going to go back to my Gochujang Loaf. So that's the reason why I guess there's two reasons why I score this in the way that I do. One is because I really like the ring. I like the way it looks. It really makes draws your eye to like, you know, the decorative portion of the loaf. But also it keeps this circular loaf in the way that I want it to. Like I score really deeply here, and when I figure out my oven, it's gonna work in the way that I'm telling you that it will. It'll rise up this way, and so. You really need, if you're finding that your decorative scoring is like exploding, it's because you don't have enough functional scoring. So maybe your ear isn't deep enough. Maybe if you're doing like the big X score, that's not enough. And so because there's like a finite amount of tension in your loaf that you build from developing the gluten in the shaping process and all of that. And so you don't want like the decorative scoring to compete with the functional scoring. Like every time you cut into the loaf of bread, you're releasing some of that tension that you built. And so, and what I was going to earlier when I was talking about just like the basic function of scoring is that when you cut into the loaf, you're controlling where and how the loaf expands. And so if the easiest way for the loaf to expand is to break through the decorative scoring, that's where it's going to go. So you have to give your loaf a deeper and larger cut than your decorative scoring. So it'll like choose that as a means to rise over the decorative scoring. I speak like this as if like the loaf actively makes decisions and thinks about things, you know? I guess that goes back to like, us naming our starters and having sourdough as pets. So the people have been saying you should cut the bread, but I would say that you do that later on your Instagram account and share a picture with everybody how your homemade bread looks like from the inside. What do you think? Yeah, everyone wants that crumb shot. What I was wondering about was going back to the scoring. would you with the stencil technique? Sorry, would you be able to get similar results using a batard like this? If you make a batard like this, could you apply the stencil technique here on the one side? Would that work?
Yeah. So a lot of the stencils that I would use on the batards like those. I think I have some examples. You may have to look a little further. But yeah, I've used my stencils on all the different kinds of shapes of my bread. I'm trying to find some examples. Like the first time I ever used the carb heart, that was on a batard, and I used a different kind of functional scoring. Sorry, it's not focusing.
Interesting scoring. Wow.
Yeah, I did a heart instead of an ear. Just like I'm talking to myself when I say this to you. Just like, don't try not to like compare yourself to like everything else that you're seeing on the internet. Just like if you're baking bread for yourself, like why not experiment? Why not try something crazy and new? Like it's how people come up with all kinds of stuff. So one of my like bread specials that I did at Proof was a Gochujang Loaf. And so that's fermented Korean red pepper paste and green onions and garlic. So I made this stencil that says gochujang in Korean to use on the loaf. And so that's one that I use on,
that sounds delicious.
Loaf. Oh, it's my baby. I'm very proud of that loaf. It's one of my favorites.
Okay, but that was the stencil technique. That was not manual scoring.
Yeah. So so that was a stencil, but I designed the stencil in a way to where it looks like scoring, right?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it looks exactly like scoring. That's why I was so confused. Yeah, you got me there.
Yeah, so that's what I like to do with my stencils is that I like to have them replicate scoring. So that, because a lot of stencils that you'll see, I don't know that I necessarily have an example, but, say this envelope is a stencil. It's like this big clunky square or rectangle with like a little design like cut out in the middle. And so what you lose with that, like, imagine there's like a cutout here and then you have this big plastic thing here. It's going to come out in the design. Unless you're just putting flour in this part, you're going to have like this big weird rectangle on your loaf when you're putting all the rice flour on. And then, maybe that's a design element that makes sense, but like, I don't know. I like the effect of having it look like bread scoring. I think it's really neat.
Yeah, it just makes the bread so unique, I think.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I've never tried it. This is something I definitely need to test a little bit more. And you really motivated me on trying this. And I see so many amazing uses for it.
Oh, yeah.
If you're a big restaurant.
Stencil, I will send you one.
And can you believe we have already been chatting for 1.5 hours?
Oh, yeah. What we were talking about earlier and just talking about bread, and you get two bread people in a room and like
they talk for 2 hours.
Yeah, we probably die of starvation before we stop talking about bread. And it's been an hour and a half of just talking about, like, I feel like it's like the shallow end of talking about bread art. Like I've just been going into like very basics of this. I haven't even, mentioned a lot of like more complex advanced techniques. So. And
we haven't even talked so much about fermentation, actual technique, right? We've only talked, just like you said, we talked about this tiny, tiny piece in the whole process, and we didn't even dive very deep. We probably could have spent 6 hours just talking about this, I guess.
Yeah, because one of my favorite techniques, and it might have, I'm not sure if it's like, I don't know if it's something that I've ever really seen done before, but in the thumbnail for this video, that Sailor Moon loaf that I'm holding, in that loaf was when I was playing around with this new technique where I would score it and then I would take sections of the loaf that I wanted to be darker than all the rest, and I would carve off that skin with my lame. And so like there's stuff like that. Huh?
I didn't even know that works.
Oh, yeah.
That sounds like a lot of work as well to do that.
Yeah, and so it's like for the love of art and the love of bread, and just like for people like me and you, it's really it's really easy to get excited about bread, right? And so this is kind of something that I used to get, the average person excited about bread. Like we know how like miraculous of a process bread is. We know how much goes into it. We know there's like a lot of magic and science, but like the average person, I think, probably takes that for granted. They're just like, okay, whatever, it's bread. But then I can show them something like this, and then, you know, suddenly, like, you know, that's kind of like a gateway to get them really interested. It's like I'm trying to express to people, you know, my love for bread in this particular way, and like to show them how cool and neat it is. Like, you know, so that's just kind of like what I do it for.
There was one great more question from Joanne Maxwell. Can you layer colors on stenciling? I mean, put down rice flour, then add color on top. Would something like that work? Have you heard about it?
Yes. So when I was telling you guys earlier that you'll be blown away by the stuff that you see on Instagram, like, I'm not kidding. Like, anyone who has an Instagram, look up the hashtag like bread art or bread artist. Bread scoring is another good one. There's a lot of people who are legitimately like painting great works of art on sourdough. One of the people I think is the best at it. You're not going to believe this is bread, but would you look at this?
That's insane.
So, like, when you think about like what's possible with using bread as a canvas, like literally anything. I'll come up with some what's really cool about this community too is that a lot of people are very excited to share their techniques, because one thing that like really motivates me to share, like I don't really feel like I want to hold a lot of secrets to my chest, because I really believe that like the more that people learn, the better the medium becomes. Like, because someone will take something that you came up with and run in a completely different direction and come up with something you never would have thought of. And so there's just like this crazy energy that we all feed off of. And we're always like taking bits and parts of other people's techniques and coming up with like the most incredible things. Like, the stuff that people are doing with bread is incredible.
So Vegan has just asked, Vegan-demic has just asked a great question here. How someone has courage to eat this piece of art. It reminds me a little bit, I heard about a painting that upon showing the painting, it would automatically self-destruct. It's a little bit like that, right? You make this amazing bread, and then you just, this piece of art, and then you destroy it afterwards.
Yeah, right? It's just like, I don't know, maybe it's like a very Buddhist thing, is that like, it's temporary. You know, it's like when you draw art on the beach or something. You know, a lot of people will tell me that. I'm trying to convince them to buy this, bread art. And they're like, well, how can I eat that? Nobody says that about like a plate of pasta that looks incredible, right?
True.
Or like a really beautiful cake. One thing that I've seen people do, especially for things like this, is that they'll kind of use this circular design as a means of like, they'll cut this around, they'll take this off, and then they'll kind of use this base as like a bread bowl, and they'll put soup or dip or whatever. But one of the first things that I ever made, like a custom design on bread I ever made for someone else, was for a friend who was giving it to like a 7-year-old for her birthday or something. And she really likes Pokemon. And so she asked me to make like a Pikachu on the loaf. And the last I heard about it is that she took, and it was over a year ago now. I think I have to ask for an update. But the kid got the Pikachu loaf and then put it on her bedstand. And it might still be there. Like, she just never wanted to cut into it or eat it. And I imagine it just like fossilizes, sourdough, if you don't get it wet or humid, it doesn't mold. So, I mean, that's an option too, is just keep it as art forever.
In 5 million years, when aliens come to our planet, they will find that piece of bread and they will wonder, what is going on here?
Yeah, and they'll see that like Pikachu was, the god of bread.
Yeah, Emerald, this has been really awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all those insights on scoring, working at the bakery, the stenciling technique. I think everybody here learned so many cool new things from you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. I could, literally talk forever.
And everybody, I also linked Emerald's Instagram account in the description of the video, and also her YouTube account. Please do check that out. And yeah, keep us posted on your progress with the stenciling shop. I would be interested myself to also buy a few cool designs.
Well, now that people know about it, maybe that's a good incentive for me to actually do it. Because it's always been kind of like, oh, you know, maybe someday, but now like we just told a bunch of people about it, so maybe I should do it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emerald. This has been really amazing. And also thank you to everybody who has been watching and all the great questions. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This was a lot of fun. See y'all on the internet.
Guten Abend.
Guten Abend.
Bye, everybody. See ya.
Bye, y'all.